Welcome back, the Sophist and Socrates. In this video, we will just get the big picture view of what's going on with the Sophist, some of the wars and the 30 tyrants in classical Athens, as well as Aristophanes. And then we'll say more about the Apology and the Crito, and then how Socrates contributed to making what could be referred to as a philosophic worldview that most of Western philosophy adheres to this day. The big picture is that these three, 1 through 3, if one is familiar with this sort of background information, the Socrates' Apology especially is much more meaningful. It will matter more. It's like if you know just a little background, some things it enlivens them. It gives one, it makes it more real, which this is real. This is about real events. So that's the reason that the sophist and some of this stuff about the wars in Athens, as well as Aristophanes, is included in this week's lecture material. Socrates, he's often claimed to be the founder or the father of Western philosophy. There's no doubt that his influence his influence and ways of asking questions and then reasoning through to potential answers and then rejecting those answers, his sort of way of approaching questions and answers and reasoning did set the stage for what eventually does become philosophy as it's practiced today. And that's undeniable in terms of Western philosophy. Now, he was obviously Socrates. We've seen people before Socrates. We've seen the pre-Socratics and their sort of proto-scientific view that they were trying to craft. Views that were alternatives to the early Greek spiritual worldview. Instead of personalized human-like gods and goddesses with the pre-Socratics, you end up with these sort of depersonalized, more like forces, like one might think of gravity or the weak and strong nuclear forces or electromagnetic forces. They didn't have electromagnetic forces in the pre-Socratic era. No, but the sort of things they're talking about are what is more prevalent today in the sciences. And so they were getting that ball rolling in the direction away from sort of supernaturalistic explanations, was what one might say, or more spiritual. If one wouldn't want to call it supernatural, they could say spiritual explanations for things and ways of viewing the world. The pre-Socratics are offered what would be a more naturalistic or more science-like way, like modern science-like way of looking at the world, but nothing with the scientific method and experimentation, all the stuff that's involved in contemporary sciences. Well, at the time like simultaneously to a little after the pre-Socratics, this group shows up, the Sophists. Well, the Sophists, who were they? In many ways, they were a group of people that was needed at the time to a certain extent in, say, classical Athens. That in classical Athens, you did not have people that went to, say, law schools like today, where they spend 3 years or more, could be 7 or more, It just depends on how far into law education one wants to go today. But they didn't have people trained like that in the intricacies of the law and crafting arguments, defending clients or prosecuting people. They did not have like some formal education systems set up to train people to defend oneself in court or to prosecute a court case. They didn't have that. But yet they still had a legal system, and there was the ability of citizens to sue one another. And what happens is when there is a need, there's people that will come to fill that void. If there's some goods or services that are needed in a society, almost certainly people that want to make money or profit or just be helpful will provide that service in time. It just seems to be a pretty common trait of humans and human societies. Well, the sophists were doing that. They were filling a need. That there was a lot of lawsuits that say one Athenian, the voting Athenian citizen, could try to sue another voting Athenian citizen or someone that's not a non-voter for various violations of Athenian law. We don't need to go into the details of all the Athenian constitutions and the laws. Every single Greek city-state, they many of them at least, tried to develop their own constitutions with their own laws, all of that. I mean, anytime you have societies when you're getting upwards of 5 to 10 to 100 to 100,000 plus people, that invariably various legal systems tend to show up to manage interactions like business deals, trade deals. And one has to keep in mind with these early Greeks during the ancient and classical period, their tremendous amounts of their economy are based on trading and business dealings with all the other cultures and societies around the Mediterranean Sea. So there was a need to manage business deals. And what happens when you make a contract and then someone doesn't, they say, okay, yeah, you get X amount of goods from the Egyptians, and then I will give you a certain amount of minas or whatever currency happened to be used in a Greek city-state at that time. And remember, there's 1,000+ city-states in the heyday of this stuff. So, and how do you resolve these contractual agreements and breaches? So there was a need for people to be trained in how to reasonably, persuasively, coherently present cases in the law courts. But there was also a need for like just business management. Like how do I manage all these various businesses I'm in? And that's where the sophists enter. But they have the reputation, whether fairly or unfairly, of teaching people not so much how to find the truth or discover what's really going on. What are the actual facts of the case? That's not so much what the sophists were teaching. They were teaching how to do argumentation and rhetoric, how to speak well in a public setting, how to speak in a way, be a good orator is what it's sometimes referred to as, how to convince people with your words and in a sense, manipulate people to get them to rule in your favor in courts, which is there that much difference between that and what happens in civil and criminal legal cases in today's system? You have a prosecutor whose job is to argue that this person's guilty of something. They violated a law. That's their job. Now, one could say that their job is to find the truth, and some do. And then there's defense attorneys that their job is to defend the client, to help them navigate the intricacies of the law and legal system in whatever country they happen to be in that has a legal system, and they defend the client. But at the core, a defense attorney, even if the truth is leaning in the direction of the client being very much guilty of whatever the crime is, a defense attorney's job is not to walk in there and say, well, prosecutor, judge, and jury, my client's guilty. That's not what the defense attorney's job is in today's society. Their job is to try to mitigate the sentencing or potentially speak in ways that persuade a jury to have doubt about whether the client that the defense attorney is representing is innocent or guilty. And so the truth may not be so much what's going on there. And it could go the same way on a prosecutorial thing, that a prosecutor may want to run for public office later and may want to have a bunch of convictions on the list of, look at all these people that did wrong and I prosecuted them. So there's human interest involved in this. And so the sophists are coming at it from that point of view. It's not about truth. It's not about falsity in terms of what they're teaching people how to do. It's how to win in court, or it's how to craft a better business contract, how to do these things that may give one an advantage, a profit, a gain over another person that's perhaps, or group that's not as well trained in such things. Now, within them, one's going to find indications of this relativist subjectivist, as well as skeptic agnostic and realpolitik and cynic worldviews that Stoics tend to, even if you give them like a charitable reading, that some of them will fit into these worldviews a little more, a little less. It's not always a perfect fit with them, but one will find indications of it, as we'll see, of these worldviews in play all throughout the Stoics. Like, for example, the relativist subjectivist worldview, it tends to doubt, reject, or at least not be concerned about what the truth happens to be, like the actual final, what is the fact of the matter. The relativist subjectivist might deny that such even exists. This is just a refresher on these worldviews, that for adherence to this kind of worldview, in turn, what the Stoics will view things as, at least the way they teach what they're teaching people to do, for a fee. They charge for their services normally. I mean, they're like a rhetoric argumentation for hire person. It's a stand-in for no formal law schools and no formal business administration schools. But there was a need for such things, so the sophists stepped in to fill it. And so the relativist subjectivist, it could all just be little t truths, like whatever Bob can win in the case and argue for is true. Well, maybe that is what's true. Maybe that's good enough. We don't need to probe any deeper. What matters is that Bob wins the case. Or if Sally has the exact opposite case and that's who happens to be paying us as a sophist, well, then we'll do everything we can to train Sally up so that she can argue for that case. And that conclusion and that end judgment, whatever it happens to be, whether it's a moral judgment, it was moral, immoral, right, wrong, goods, bads, true, false, that's really largely irrelevant. It's just pure argumentation, just pure lawyering, if you want to think of it that way. That's what a lot of the sophists seem to have been teaching. Now, some of them could have been more concerned about truth, and some were. In a big T, truth, objective, independently existing from human whims and desires situation. Some probably, did think that way, but that's not necessarily what the skills they're teaching people how to do will end up with. There's also skeptic agnosticism. You'll see that in some of the sophists, that not just the ones talked about in this handout, but there's many more that are not talked about in this handout. And we have a lot of their stuff secondhand, third hand, like most of the material from the pre-Socratics, the sophists. It's just coming through different hands and being described. I mean, like a lot of the descriptions we have of sophists are coming through Plato's dialogues and his writings. And Plato was not a fan of the sophists. So is there a possibility that they're somewhat misrepresented at times? It's totally possible. But all we have to do as far as the class is to just get a feel for what they were typically associated with and the sort of ways that the things that are said about them, what sort of worldviews it would reflect. And then how is what they're doing relevant to the apology and Socrates' criminal trial? That's our concerns. The skeptic agnostic may doubt various claims about reality, big T truth claims, things like that. But typically what separates a skeptic from an agnostic is a skeptic's typically going to say, well, we don't know the answer to this because of various human or technological limits. Like we just do not have the mental, emotional, technological, whatever it happens to be, maturity or abilities yet to determine the truth or falsity or of something in reality or the world. We just don't know because we're not able to know yet. The agnostic would be more like, well, I don't know, and they don't have a take on it one way or another. Either would do or neither would do. The agnostic's a little more happy-go-lucky sort of personality where it's better just to be like, well, I'm still not sure. You've given me your arguments, your reasons, show me your evidence. I don't know. Just not sure. And the agnostics is not typically going to be like, well, We don't have the technology to find the answer out to that yet. We don't know because. That's the hallmark of a skeptic sort of worldview. The agnostic worldview is more like, well, I just don't know. Simple as that. So it's a little less reasoning involved. Now, the real politic and cynic worldview, we will see a lot of that during this video, and that's good because it is a worldview that's out there. It's a way of making sense of things and understanding what's happening, but primarily is focused on legal dealings, political dealings, social dealings, moral dealings, but it's focused on a kind of circumscribed, bounded in domain of truth. That the real politic and the cynic do think there's a truth out there. That there is a truth about these events. When treaty negotiators go into a room, there are certain facts about what's going to happen, what techniques will work, what techniques are not going to work, what are the actual economic, military, social realities of each of their individual countries, and that they're coming up with a treaty normally to do trade or perhaps prevent a war or all those sorts of things. And those are realities that if they don't get that right, it could be very damaging to their countries. And so the real politic worldview, or adherent to that kind of worldview, is focused on what's happening on the ground, what is actionable. Like if we were to approach country X, if we're treaty negotiators and we were to approach them with certain proposals, are they going to reject those automatically because that's just not going to work with the reality of the country? Or might they be more prone to accept certain proposals because that is more in line with the economic, military, all those things, facts on the ground for that country? So they're not denying, like the relativists may be, well, it's just whatever, the negotiators think or feel or believe. Well, that's not the real politics. Senate person doesn't look at it like that. They tend to look at it like, no, there's realities that we run into, and they object if the world itself will kick you back if you try to do things that don't cohere with the way things are. And what they're trying to do is they're not focused on how the world could be or how laws are should be passed or could be passed. They're focused on how are they actually passed. Like, what are people actually doing in the rooms behind the scenes, behind closed doors? And so we'll see that sort of worldview very significantly in someone like Thrasymachus. And it doesn't always have to be a sort of negative take on things. Some people would say Thrasymachus is kind of negative. Well, that may be true, but it doesn't have to go that way. It can just be very prudent if someone's an ambassador or working in a diplomatic corps to know how another group, the groups that one's going to have to interact with, what things are going to work. Some things will and some things won't. There are certain cultural taboos. There are certain ways of presenting information. Not all cultures and groups see things the same way or live in the same way. So that's real politics, focused on the ground. How do we get this done, or how do we keep from failing in legal, political, etc. senses? Now, with the sophists, we won't go through all these. Like, there's Gorgias. You get a sense that initially what the sophists describe that they're doing and training people to do doesn't seem so bad. I mean, it seems like they're doing a helpful service. And in many cases, they probably were. But then you'll always get things inside the sophist where they're like, for example, this Gorgias idea. The rhetorician is competent, or the rhetorician, however you want to pronounce it. This is what Gorgias is trying to train people to be. And so what will a student that exits successfully after they paid Gorgias the fee probably, what will this person be able to do? Will they be competent to speak against anybody on any subject and to prove himself more convincing before a crowd on practically any topic he wishes? Well, that doesn't seem to be bounded to anything like this person will be able to competently speak on and get to the truth of things. No, that's not what this is talking about. This is sounding more like persuasive political or legal speech. And that's exactly what they were up to. And they did a lot of work, like Gorgias and them. That you have to kind of put yourself in the mindset that all of these kind of argumentative techniques, they may have existed, but the sophists introduced them into mainstream Greek societies. They were offering to train people in them, and that was new. And there were centers of learning in the ancient and classical world, and people could go and learn to do this. The sophists obviously learned it from somewhere. Some of them were self-taught, but they were learning it from people. So this is knowledge that's being passed down, but the sophists are tooling what they're teaching their students of how to navigate and win in the context of the legal political realities of classical Athens, for example, or in Corinth or places like that in the ancient world. And it doesn't seem like they're bound to we're trying to get to what's really the case. No, you'll be able to win. And there's a potentially humorous rumored event that's worth checking out of how sophistry kind of worked, where you could make a case between student and teacher. They each make their case of why the student should or shouldn't pay, and then it's helpful to think through that, see what is going on here. Definitely worth checking that example out. Protagoras. The Protagoras, whether fairly or unfairly, is always associated with this line right here. Man is the measure of all things, meaning humans are the measure of all things, of the things that are, that they are, and the things that are not, that they are not. That can be taken a lot of different ways, but the standard way of reading it is a sort of battle cry of a relativistic subjectivist worldview. That the idea is that it's not saying that the gods and goddesses are the measure of all things. You can immediately contrast this with an early Greek spiritual worldview. That, well, on the early Greek spiritual worldview, it's the gods, the goddesses, the spiritual forces, it's the muses, it's the fates, it's all of these other entities. The fates actually measure the length of a person's lifetime, how long they're going to exist, and then when that's going to stop in the early Greek spiritual worldview. So this is very different. This is putting the human and the human being and humans in the judgment determiner slots for all things, not just some things, all things. And that means that it's our own group or individual perceptions or beliefs that are the judges and determiners of what's going on. In a sense, that what we perceive is the case is the case. If the wind feels hot to me and it feels cold to you, well, according to this sort of view, well, then you're right. You've determined it's cold to you. I've determined it's hot to me, or whichever way it goes. And that's basically the end of it. We don't have to go any deeper than that. That's kind of the facts. That's the truths, the lowercase t truths, small t truths. And in philosophy, that distinction matters. There's the truth that exists independently of us. And then there's these little truths like my truth, your truth, Sally's truth, Bob's truth. That sort of stuff is what's operating within this kind of worldview. Man is the measure of all things, human. It doesn't have to be man. It could be woman or whatever. It's just a matter of human beings are the measure of all things. That humans are deciding what is real, what's not real, what's true, what's false. It's not some fact of the world or reality that's impinging upon us and getting us to recognize it whether we want to or not. And so Protagoras is associated with this and this idea, and it's one of the first examples in sort of the Western canon or in terms of Western civilization. You're getting this articulated really clearly, this sort of relativism. which should sound familiar to people in today's time. At least the ideas of it, because it's very, very prevalent. And also the relative subjectiveness is in a sense you're constructing, reality. You're making it as you're perceiving, or whole groups can make it for their nation, things like that. And then, as I mentioned, how is this quite different than the early Greek spiritual worldview? Well, like the pre-Socratics were different in that they depersonalized or de-anthropomorphized the gods and goddesses and came up with these sort of, more neutral forces and deities. Well, the sophists differ from that in that they're more like skeptical or agnostic. It's like whether the gods exist or not, Protagoras is like, well, he's not in a position to ascertain whether they exist or they don't. But think about that. Protagoras just said that human beings are the measure of all things. They determine what exists, what doesn't. But yet then when it comes to the gods and goddesses, he's like, well, he's personally not in a position to determine that. But how is that consistent? That if humans are indeed the determiners, then shouldn't Protagoras, a smart guy here, be able to make that determination about whether gods or goddesses exist or don't? There's likely some sort of just tact here or prudence to that. If he had said that, well, that can land him in charges of being impious at this time. And so just because you had the pre-Socratics, cast a little doubt in the direction of the early Greek spiritual worldview, you have the sophists definitely casting some doubt there, ignoring it entirely, seemingly in some cases. The early Greek spiritual worldview itself was still fully operating, fully within the legal systems of the day, and there were laws that you couldn't say certain things in public. Now you'd be charged as being a corrupter in various things. We'll see that when we get to Socrates. That it can be a life or death situation. So he's hedging his bets, very likely. If that, with that notion attributed to Protagoras. But either way, that's Gorgias, Protagoras. There's Thrasymachus. Thrasymachus is interesting to read. Always, it's might makes right. That's his sort of observation about how governments and governing bodies of societies actually work. Thrasymachus's core claim is that a group takes power. It doesn't matter if it's a tyranny, a democracy, an oligarchy that's ruled by a few, a democracy. There's lots of different things. It doesn't matter if it's capitalist, communist, whatever. That none of that would be relevant to Thrasymachus would talk about it. He didn't talk about it in capitalism, communism, things like that, those terms, but he did talk in terms of tyrannies and oligarchies and other stuff. And democracies. He talked in those terms. And what he would say is that regardless of the political governance, however you pick your leaders or they pick themselves, that what always happens is some small group or one person gets at the top, and then they make laws, and by those laws they dictate what is going to be considered good and okay, what's going to be considered bad and not okay. What is just and what is unjust is totally determined by the humans at the top with the power. And that's supposedly applying to all forms of governance. It doesn't matter if you vote people in. It doesn't matter if they, take power and put themselves in. That in the end, it always comes down to a small select group of normally highly organized leaders, rulers, and they make up what's right, wrong, good, and bad, just or unjust for everybody else. That's Thrasymachus' view. I'm not saying his view's right. But he gives examples, tries to give reasons for why he thinks that's the way the real politics situation. How does governance actually work in real human societies? Not maybe how we want it to work or ideally how it should work. He's not talking about that. He's just talking about this is what he thinks the facts are. This is what the reality of humans governing other humans is. Might he be right? Might he be wrong? That's for people in the class to decide. But that's the idea. And so you have a small group that sets themselves in power, gets voted into power, doesn't matter. they have the might. They're able to command the militaries or the law enforcers, and so they have the might. And then they make the right with it. They make their rules. If people don't follow them, they send their might out in the form of law enforcement, in forms of military, and they nicely coax people to where they want them to go, or they forcibly stomp on them until they go or they cease to be. And so that's the might forcing whatever. It protects who? Well, it normally protects those in power. That's the way Thrasymachus sees things. And for him, those who take advantage of such things and act that way always profit more in societies. That's where people tend to have some moral qualms about Thrasymachus. Is he encouraging people to behave this way? Well, not necessarily, but he's saying that the people who do behave that way, like if you're in a waiting room and there's a bowl with candy in it, and it says, "Please take one." And then the decent, the honest, the just person, they say, "Oh, I want a piece of candy." They take one. I'll leave. It's asked me to do this, but moreover, a person will think, I don't need to be selfish. Well, with Thrasymachus, he's like that selfish, unjust person that walks in and sees the sign to "Please take one," and they just scoop the whole bowl out and put it in their bag and go sit back down, so no one else gets any candy. That person got more candy, so that person won. They took what they wanted. And then he goes even further and says that he doesn't say this phrase, but it's a common phrase, that history is written by the victors, that the people who ultimately seize the might and the control, well, they write whatever history they want. And they're going to write themselves as being just and wonderful and moral when all the dust is settled. So generations later are going to think, yeah, these people were heroes. They did wondrous things. They freed us from something bad, or they built us into this wondrous thing we are today. And many people may not know the difference. That the mighty make whatever truth, it would be little t truth, but whatever truth they want to keep their own power. That's Thrasymachus. We'll come across more ideas of that sort throughout the semester. And I'm not saying one has to accept or reject any of these positions. They're just what are associated with a particular sophist. Now, we have those in view. We have the sophist. So the idea of making the weaker argument stronger, not really worried about truth. They could be kind of teaching people how to manipulate other people. Perhaps not the most trustworthy individuals you could ever want. They could very well be tyrants in disguise. Kind of negative connotations hovering around the sophist. That's what you kind of need to have before you get into Socrates' criminal trial. The classical Athens, the wars and the 30 tyrants. We won't go through all this. You can read it. It's pretty straightforward. That ultimately the way the wars that's relevant to us for understanding Socrates' apology is that Athens and Sparta were the two big city states in the Greek domain at this period in history. But there was also Corinth. There were other big city states too. But Athens and Sparta are the ones you hear the most about. And why is that? Well, because Athens backed a revolt against what was at the time the biggest sort of superpower entity on the block, which was the Persian Empire, with Darius and Xerxes and various other leaders. And what the Athenians did is they backed this group of Greeks to be able to revolt from the rule of the Persians. It was over in Asia Minor, in the area where modern-day Turkey is today, or Turkey. And the idea is that they backed this revolt, and the Persians, well, they weren't having that. And so they bring in their armies. Well, interestingly enough, the Persians had hundreds of thousands of troops. The Greeks did not. And yet the Greeks, through these various little battles, they pushed back the Persians. That you can look up things like, there's a movie that it's fictionalized, like the 300, where you have the Battle of Thermopylae. And the Spartans, the 300 Spartans, which was actually more like maybe 300 to 800 Spartans with like 7,000 or 8,000, you know, um, troops of other non-Spartans. There were troops there, but they were holding off tens to 100,000 plus Persians from coming in this one pass. Well, they all were killed in the end, but it delayed the Persians enough and it motivated the rest of the Greek peoples that they fought back. And eventually the Greeks kind of got the Persians so that they did not just, they were not captured, enslaved, and controlled economically, socially, politically. They were not absorbed by the Persian Empire. But then there's this idea that they may have very well picked the fight in the beginning with it. It's kind of like, go poke a bear and then see what happens. Well, that's kind of what they did. But in this case, those who did the original poking of the giant Persian bear, they came out ahead for a little while. The end result of this Greco-Persian war is that the Athens and Sparta became what at the time would be, and even today the word applies, as they were superpowers. They were hegemons. Well, what is that? Simply, they are a economic, political, social entity. It could be a whole nation, or it could be just a Greek city-state that has enormous amount of control and influence on all the countries or city-states surrounding them. That it's like anything near Sparta, the Spartans could say, hey, don't pick that leader, pick this one. This one's more friendly to us. And they could mess with their processes of picking leaders. Or if some city-state near them didn't want to do trade the way the Spartans wanted it done, well, the Spartans could force them to do the trade the way they wanted it to be done. Athens did the same thing. And so they're both, you've got two big superpower entities with not only the city-states of Athens and Sparta, but all the surrounding city-states of them that form their own leagues and groups of allies. And so you've got these two big, powerful entities that are accustomed to getting their way right next to each other. Just like in modern times, that kind of stuff ends up with wars, proxy wars, all kinds of stuff. And so it did back then too. People were people then too. And so in the end of the war with the Persians turns into, eventually, Athens and Sparta are the most dominant city-states in the Greek area. Then they, for whatever reasons, clash themselves, the two superpowers. It could be there's a lot of reasons. You can read, like, say, Thucydides, History of the Peloponnesian War, and various other Greek writings of the time that tried to explain what happened. But it could be that Sparta was just paranoid that Athens was coming in, going to take it over. It's like, if we don't do something, they're going to take us. So we just as soon try to take control of them first. Could have been that. Could have been that the Athenians were actually encroaching on legit recognized Spartan provinces and trying to put economic and trade sanctions on them, which that just means, you can't trade with these people. You have to trade the way we want. Essentially, Athens could have been coming in trying to tell people that are under the protection of Sparta and control and influence and protection of Sparta, trying to enforce Athenian superpower wants on someone that was already claimed and to fall under Spartan superpower wants. And so that could have been the cause of it. Or it could just be that you got two giant, powerful political, military, and naval entities right next to each other. And they just decided, well, who's going to rule us all? And so they went to war for that. Wars are happening for economic reasons, for resource reasons, for political reasons, for spiritual reasons, for ways of life reasons, worldview reasons. There's a lot of reasons that wars can happen. But typically, if you got two superpowers next to each other, it happens historically. Well, then there's like one of the end results is after the Sparta and Athens fight, Sparta wins ultimately. This war went on a long time. It happened during the time of some of the pre-Socratics, some of the sophists. It happened during Socrates' life. It was going on for at least the early part of Plato's life. They end up, Sparta wins. Then you end up with Athens. Well, Sparta won the war, so it gets to dictate the terms. That's the way it typically goes. And so it set up, it backed various Athenians that were inside Athens at the time after Athens was lost the war. So these are Athenian citizens, as well as some people that had been exiled from Athens that came back after Sparta won the war. They come back to Athens, and then that with Sparta's backing, there's 30 tyrants are established. Well, what this was is 30 people, and it goes the way you would think. They get installed. They wipe out their opponents. They're the people who would be advocates for democracy, things like that. And Athenian democracy, we'll talk more about that next week with Plato. It wasn't necessarily like, the way that democracy happens, say, in the United States today. It was a little different than that. Similar, but not the same. And there's similarities. But the 30 tyrants, they came in, they take out the Democrat opposition leaders, the Democratic. This is not like political party Democratic. It's Democrat in the sense of democracy. People who wanted Athens to remain a democracy, those were opposition. The 30 tyrants took them out. They also took out the people who essentially would have been mostly trained by the sophists, run around doing lawfare, suing people, trying to get money. They took those people out. That made the people with lots of money and power happy in Athens. So this is building a base of support. Then they requested a garrison of Spartan soldiers. They were agreed they'd get the garrison as long as they paid for it. And then they used that garrison to take out perceived or imagined or real threats to their power. And then they went through, they passed laws. Immediately, they created a list of 3,000 good Athenians. And, so you got to have the good that's in agreement with the 30. They didn't have to be in agreement with the 30, but they weren't opponents to them, and they would go along with them, mostly. It's kind of the idea of the good ones, according to the 30 tyrants. And they picked them and themselves, and they made them, the 30 made themselves exempt from all the laws they passed. Well, of course, rules for thee and not for me. That's standard if someone's going to be in power and doesn't want anybody to challenge it. And the idea is this stuff still happens all over throughout the world today. We may not hear about it, but it happens. Or it's covered up better than it was at this time. This time they didn't mind. They just do it. Out in the open. But the idea is they passed laws that disarmed everybody in Athens besides the 30 and perhaps the 3,000 good Athenians. Then they passed a law that the 30 could order the deaths of anybody that wasn't in the 30 or in the 3,000. And so they're just gaining more and more power. Eventually they had some internal strife amongst themselves. And in the long run, they banished all of the Athenians and the people that were not of Athens but lived in Athens at the time. They kicked all of them out of Athens. And so then you have the 30 and the 3,000 and very likely other supporter staff and various things there. But they kicked out the majority of people out of Athens. They say, well, now we're safe. We got everybody that potentially disagrees with us outside the walls. But then those people outside the walls, there was a general, a Greek general. He amassed forces. One would suspect from some of these people that just got booted out of their homes. Then they came back. There's battles. And they eventually take out the 30 tyrants. What's interesting is to notice that the 30 tyrants, this is only about 8 months they did all this. 8 months to a year. Then they're out of power within a month or two, once they get pushed back. So it's like it didn't last long. They did damage, though, while they were there. And there was a lot of bad sentiment about this, as one would expect of those people that got kicked out or had family members killed or hurt or the property seized by the 30 tyrants. There's a lot of animosity about this. Well, then when they're kicked out, Athens kind of regains control of itself and tries to become a sort of democracy again. It doesn't last very long because Sparta still has won the overall war and it'll reassert itself. But there is this sort of period in time where Athens gets rid of the 30. And then within that span of time is when Socrates' criminal trial happens. And then after his criminal trial, it eventually reverts back to Spartan control. And then eventually the Macedonians come in and take all of Greek stuff with Alexander the Great and his dad, Philip II. But then after that, the Romans come in. So it's like that's just when you're just jumping the hundreds of years in history, it goes pretty quickly, it seems. But this stuff happened over the course of many, many years. But the thing to keep in mind is these various aspects of why is the 30 tyrants and this history of Athens and Sparta, why is it relevant to the apology? Well, it's relevant because Socrates wasn't kicked out of Athens, it doesn't seem. That means it's likely he was either on the list of the good 3,000 or either he was protected by some on the list. And then, moreover, he did indeed interact with and know, like, one of the head 30 tyrants, Critias, or Critias, however you want to say it, that he did know him, and they could have been on decent terms. And so it's like Socrates, he was associated in the minds when the Athenians that were kicked out came back in the city. Well, the 3,000 would have still been in the city. They didn't immediately get killed or booted out. If Socrates is one of those, then all these other Athenians that got kicked out will know this about Socrates. They will know that he was either a part of them, he collaborated with them, he agreed with them, or perhaps he just got caught up in the midst of it and stayed alive. He supposedly did reject one of their orders to kill a famous general and said, no, you can kill me, but I'm not killing this guy that's a good guy. So it's like there is evidence, at least from Socrates' mouth and some in the mouths of Xenophon, that Socrates didn't just go along with all this. That it's like you get caught up in things, in these situations, in the past and in the present, it can happen. And so just because he survived doesn't mean he was right there with them in pro-Sparta, but that association's there. And definitely it's likely it was in the minds of some of the jurors during this criminal trial. Now, Aristophanes with comedy, the main thing to take away from this is it's always worth reading Aristophanes if you find a decent translation of his works, his comedic plays. His stuff is absurd, but it can be very funny. It can be very base humor, but no matter, it had a purpose. That all of the Athenian plays, whether tragic or comedic, always had a civic, political, social, moral, spiritual purposes. That they were not just for mere entertainment of the citizens. And that attendance to these things was mandatory for the voting Athenian body. That they had to attend these things. So anytime it's mandatory by the government that you have to watch the plays, that doesn't seem like those plays are going to be solely just to entertain you. No, they're there to educate, to keep a sort of cultural ideas, social ideas in mind. And so Aristophanes, though, what he did in his comedies, he always had a sort of moral to the story or a message. And a lot of times his heroes are just the everyday farmers, the everyday, pottery maker. That's the heroes of his comedies, if you want to say they're heroes. And then just everyday fathers and sons and mothers and daughters, things like that. Just everyday Athenian citizens. They're the heroes. The villains or the buffoons, the absurd, are always those with lots of power, that are well thought of, that are the intellectuals, the politicians, the war generals. Things like that. Those are the villains, are made to be look very absurd. It's lampooning. It's like Aristophanes is like one of your original in today's terms. He was making whole comedies that are like one big meme, trying to embarrass or get one over on these powerful people. But it's not just that. It's the idea of communicating a message. Like one of his plays, Peace, is a good example of this. It's included in here as comments about it. that in peace he has a farmer that's just tired of the Peloponnesian War. That's the war between Athens and Sparta. I mean, it's like the second Peloponnesian War technically. But the idea is he's just tired of it. So he gets on a giant flying dung beetle, a beetle that plays around in poop, but it's a big one, the size of a horse or bigger, and flies up to the domain of the gods and goddesses and says, "Hey, can we work something out here? We this war, this is brutal. Can we have a little peace, a little festival, some good harvest?" And instead of having troops burning the fields and things, could we just calm things down a bit? Well, he gets up there, he finds out that the god of war and various other human financial profiteers off of the war, they've put peace and harvest and festival and all these goddesses of what he would want and spirits of it, they're in a cave. Well, he gets in with some people and they free him from the cave, and then the war ends and things. And notice that the moral is that the war, there were many opportunities it could have been stopped earlier with a lot less devastation, but it wasn't, because you had these people war profiteering off of it. And so the moral is it's better for war. War is better for just a small group of people that make a lot of money off of it. But the rest of the people suffer terribly under war conditions. And that still tends to be true today. And there's a message there that he's trying to communicate to these powerful people, because keep in mind, all these people that Aristophanes is making fun of and lampooning, they're often sitting in the front row right there at the stage while these plays are there. And he got lawsuits against him for doing this and things, but you had a pretty good bit of freedom of speech in certain ways in Athens, not in all ways. As we'll see, you didn't get to talk about just anything you wanted to, especially when it involves the spiritual worldview. But either way, in the play, The Clouds, Aristophanes presents his Socrates character, and he presents him as just a sophist, a pre-Socratic, and basically an atheist that's just absolutely absurd, and he's teaching people to be the same way, and he's corrupting the youth, getting them to lose all their morals, their values. They will abuse their parents. Then so the message is this newfound sophist education, which did exist during Aristophanes' time, is not good. It's bad. It corrupts the youth. We don't want that. That's the moral message of The Clouds. And then he puts Socrates as the ringleader, the head of the thinkery, which is the sophist school that's in a hovel. I mean, it's comedy, and it's lampooning, and it is funny. But the reality is that this stuff, remember, these plays, whether comedy or tragedy, they have significant civil, practical consequences for these people that get made fun of sometimes. And so that may have been Socrates does think that the play The Clouds negatively impacted the minds of the jurors that he was facing during his criminal trial. So to get to Socrates' apology, the apology is not an apology in the sense of Socrates begging for forgiveness. Oh, I did wrong. Now, please forgive me. That's not what it means. Apology in the Greek sense meant defense. It's like your legal defense at trial. It's your arguments on your own, on behalf of you that you're accused of something, and somebody's accusing you of doing something wrong, and you give reasons to think, no, I didn't do those things. I'm not guilty of whatever these charges is. So you could just as soon say the defense and swap that out for the word apology. But either way, within the apology, what you get is not only Socrates' defense against various accusations, but what's even more significant, perhaps for us, is that you get his defense of doing philosophy as he understood it, and his willingness to sacrifice all to continue doing what he was doing, and his reasons for that. You get that as well in the apology. That's why we read it still to this day in intro to philosophy classes. But these criminal trials, they're not like presumed innocent until proven guilty. That didn't operate in the Athenian time. That came into play seemingly more in the Roman times than the classical and ancient Greek times. Many times You're brought into court, you're accused of something, in the default position, people who are not trained up by the sophist, all they could do is beg for mercy. They get on their bellies and say, please don't kill me. Here's my family, here's my friends. They'll tell you how great of a person I am, a lot of wailing and crying and begging. That was normal and expected in these cases. But then there's also those who are trained by the sophist or others that are just able to do argumentation that are not sophists. And that would fall into like Socrates and a lot of the people he was around. And so you could make a defense of yourself, and Socrates certainly tried to do so. But there's 500 jurors, so you have 500 jurors, not 12 or 6 or 3. You got 500 of various Athenian voting citizens that are selected by lot. So there is a randomicity to who's going to be on there, but it depends on whether the lots are biased or not too. But either way, there's 500 jurors. And then Socrates is there. Well, he says that he starts out and he just says, well, I'm not a good speaker. Where this picks up is you get the impression that you're getting right after all the accusations have been leveled against Socrates. His current accusers, the most recent ones, have already given, their thoughts of why Socrates has done all these bad things, supposedly. And so where the apology begins is where it picks up with Socrates talking. This was a transcript written by Plato, which was a friend, and he learned a lot from Socrates. Some people would say he's like Socrates' disciple, the equivalent of like that. And he was in many ways. And so he's writing this transcript. The idea is you could think, well, there might be some bias in there. There may be, but Plato wrote this right after the trial, basically, is what is thought. And if that's the case, there was a lot of people that would have been there, would have seen it, would have been totally familiar with what was going on. So Plato couldn't have just invented from whole cloth these events. So most scholars and philosophy people tend to trust Plato's transcript of what actually happened there, or that it's not too far inaccurate. And so the idea is that the apology picks up with Socrates talking. He tells the jurors, hey, I'm not as good of a speaker and not deceptive and all that like my accusers have just told you I was. And then he says, I'll just tell you the truth of what's going on. And then he's like, okay, he makes a distinction between earlier and more recent accusers. That he says these earlier accusers are the most dangerous. They're the ones that are the most damaging as far as his legal case goes. That's people like Aristophanes writing his plays about the clouds that have already put in the jurors' minds, since some of them were very young, that when they were kids, they would have encountered the ideas from their parents or whatever from Aristophanes' plays, like the clouds, where Socrates is a pre-Socratic, sort of atheistic, sophist, that, or at least someone that believes in all kinds of newfangled gods and goddesses, that's not believing in the gods of Athens. But moreover, he's teaching other people how to make bad arguments seem good. And he's teaching that to the young, and he's really corrupting their minds and just messing up our morally upstanding Athenian populace, or polis, as it was sometimes called. And so that is what Socrates thinks these earlier accusers have already done in the minds. Essentially, they've already brainwashed the jurors. And he can't call them as witnesses because some of these poets or playwrights would have already been dead at the time. He can't even call all these people who would have put what he would call false accusations. He can't call them to be a witness in one way or another because they're not alive anymore, or those that would have spread these rumors, they're not in court that day. So it's like trying to fight shadows when you're trying to fight the earlier accusers. But he says, well, he will try to defend himself against these earlier accusers. First of all, he's not a pre-Socratic. I mean, he didn't have anything against the pre-Socratics personally, not some of them at least. And that he says, was anybody ever seen me, you on the jury, in the audience? Have you ever seen me teaching things like pre-Socratics about the boundless, for example, or atoms in the void? And I mean, we don't know if somebody said, "Yeah, I've seen you, Socrates," or "No, I've never seen you." We don't know what the response to that was. But the idea is that no one came, as far as what we have with the transcript. We don't know if somebody came forward or not to confirm or deny, but Socrates claims he's not a pre-Socratic, and that he implies that very few to no one in the court is going to have ever heard him talking about these things of new gods and throw out. We're not really worried about the old gods. He'd say, "Well, who's heard me talk about that? No one." Or if any, it would have been in a context not where I was trying to teach somebody to believe that way. Then he denies that he's a sophist teacher, that he does not try to make the weaker argument appear stronger, that he's never taken a fee for any of his services. Remember, that's the hallmark of the sophist, is they're an argumentative rhetoric person for hire. They'll teach you how to argue for a case one way or another, regardless of truth, as long as you pay them. Well, Socrates says, I've never been paid for anything. I talk, people listen, I ask questions. It's no one's here going to say that I've ever charged them a fee. So I can't be a sophist like Aristophanes would portray him as, and also a pre-Socratic like Aristophanes would portray him as. He says, there's nobody that said I've done any of these things. Then he raises an objection on behalf of the judges or the jurors that are sitting there. He says, well, some might wonder, Socrates, what have you been doing? You ended up in court here for a reason. So what is it you've been doing? Surely you've been doing something different and strange out in Athens. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here before us today. And Socrates says, yep, I have been doing something quite a little different, but let me tell you the story of where I think these rumors come from and these slanders and these accusations. Is that he tells his tale, and you can read through it, but the key to it all is that he had a friend or an acquaintance that goes to the Oracle of Delphi, which is the voice. It's an oracle that's supposedly just channeling the words of the god Apollo. And the friend or the acquaintance Socrates says, well, is Socrates the wisest man in Athens? And the oracle comes back with, yes, Socrates is the wisest. Well, Socrates, it's not that he disbelieved the words of the oracle, because that would be straight from the god Apollo. It's that he just had a hard time accepting it. He's like, I don't think I know that much. How can I be the wisest? Surely there's people in Athens that are experts in the spiritual domain, in the money domains, in the making pottery domains, making poems and plays domains, that they're wiser than me. Sure, that just seemed to him like that was more likely. But yet, the god Apollo, through the oracle, has said that Socrates is the wisest. So this is a dilemma for him. So what happens is Socrates, for however or whyever, it seems that he considered that he had been assigned a god-appointed mission. That the god Apollo, through the Oracle of Delphi, had given him the mission, the task, the purpose in life to go forth in Athens and question these expert people and these powerful people, these supposed people that are so wise, and then reveal whether they're wise or not. If they're not, their ignorance is on full display in the public domain. That's what Socrates says is the case. Whether it was or not, I don't know, but it's what he says. But he surely seemed inside the apology to keep coming back to this idea that I'm just doing what the gods ordered me to do. But in the context of this, keep in mind, what is he doing? And you can see this in other early writings of Plato. We do have quite a few of them. They're listed in a footnote earlier in this handout with the Euthyphro and various other Hippias, those dialogues with Socrates as a character in them. That what you see is that Socrates will go up to somebody, say Euthyphro, which this happened supposedly right before he goes into this criminal trial. Well, Euthyphro's like a head priest in charge of knowing the right way to do the rituals to the gods and goddesses. That Euthyphro would know what piety, like right spiritual religious practice would be. And what it means for your practice to be right, in line with the gods. And and in accordance with their wishes and stuff. And so he asks Euthyphro, he sees him on the street or he's outside the courtroom and there's other people around. And he's like, well, Euthyphro, what is piety? And then he goes through this long chain of reasons. Euthyphro will say, well, Socrates, piety is X. And then Socrates will give an example and say, well, if piety's that, then these other things follow. And so piety doesn't look like it's X anymore. It looks like Y. And then Euthyphro's like, well, here's what I meant, Socrates. And so then they go along. And the end result of it is Euthyphro, and neither Euthyphro nor Socrates nor anybody standing around comes up with a satisfactory definition and understanding of what piety actually is. Well, what does that do? That reveals that Euthyphro, which is this person known and famous for being the most knowledgeable spiritual ritual priest in the community, didn't know what piety was, the most fundamental concept to being the head priest. So that exposes Euthyphro's own ignorance. And with that, what happens is Socrates does this with all kinds of people, all the supposed experts. And he would say he's doing his God-appointed mission, that this is what Apollo's tasked him with doing, and all the other divine beings backing Apollo. And so it's like he has no choice. It's not like he wants to embarrass these people, but in order to fulfill his divinely appointed mission, he does this. And what happens is, as one might suspect, that he discovers something. He discovers what's known as Socratic wisdom. And this is crucially important to understanding how philosophy itself functions. That Socrates comes to the realization or acceptance of maybe he is a little wiser than others in Athens. Why? Because he knows that he doesn't know anything about much anything that's important. And he doesn't claim otherwise. It's like Socrates, you could phrase it like, I know what I don't know, and I don't claim to know what I know I don't know. I mean, that's one way to phrase it. But it's essentially a recognition of one's own knowledge or epistemic limits, and that you know so little about so much important things that you would want to know a lot more, but you just don't. And you don't go out in public acting like you know more than you actually do. It's a tremendous amount of humility at one's own limits when it comes to what you know. So what would make Socrates wise is just a recognition of his own limits and not being arrogant or pretentious or self-serving enough to claim that he knows something when in fact he doesn't. And he knows he doesn't know. And so that is a hallmark of, like, especially Western philosophy, this idea of being humble about the limits of what you know. And throughout this class, you'll see things like that even with me, where I'll say, I can give reasons, I can give answers, I can raise questions, but in the end, you'll see it sometimes where I'll say, I don't know. And it's just a part of philosophy where we don't necessarily have all the ultimate answers to all the things we can reason for and offer reasons for and argue for. It would be awesome, maybe it would be, if we did have all these answers, but we don't yet as humans. And so what philosophy people do is just try to find what are the reasons in support or denial of various answers to questions. And they're not trying to say, this is the answer, this is the only answer, because inherently it's built into this, is that the one thing you learn and this happens whether it's philosophy or any other graduate school, one of the most common things that people will talk about or say, yeah, this sounds about right, is the more school you do, the more you realize you don't know. It's not a matter of you go through school and you start knowing a lot more. You do, no doubt about it, but you gain a lot. But what happens is the more we learn about things, the more we realize we don't know about those things. It's like for every one question we answer satisfactorily, it tends like 1,000 others open up. And that happens whether you're in engineering, it's software, hardware, robotics, and I've worked in those fields. And I can assure you that the more circuits I know how to build, the more circuits I know that I don't know how to build. I find them and I'm like, wow, I've never seen that before. That's an entirely different way of writing software, this particular function in a program. And it's like, and because different people will have discovered different things. And it's not possible anymore for your average person to know everything about all things in the world. All that we can do is learn pieces of it. And in this Socratic wisdom, the whole idea is a recognition that we are limited in what we know at any given time. And it's better practice to not claim that we know something we don't know. We don't. And so that's how Socrates realized maybe he is the wisest in Athens, but only to the small extent that he doesn't make the mistake like Euthyphros seems to be making, where Euthyphros sets himself up as the head priest, meaning that he knows how to be pious before the gods and goddesses, and yet when asked publicly, well, what is piety, he did no answers arrived. They do not arrive at a satisfactory answer for anybody. That exposes that Euthyphros has been claiming to know something and be an expert in something that he indeed doesn't know. And Socrates does this with the big powerhouse politicians in Athens. And as one would suspect, doing this, Socrates is there. This embarrasses people publicly. It tarnishes their reputation. And as one would suspect, these big powerful people don't really like this. So it makes him a lot of enemies. And that's where Socrates thinks the earlier accusers have the upper hand, because this would have been talked about, known about, Socrates being a pest and an annoyance and embarrassing these powerful people, the experts, and being relentless with doing so. Imagine how annoying this probably was to these people. And it's like, was it the most smart thing Socrates could have done? Maybe not. But he felt like it was this God-appointed mission, that this is what he's supposed to do after the Oracle of Delphi's comments. And that's what Socrates claims is the case. I mean, we're not alive 2,500 years in the past. We can't know, what was going on in his own mind at this time. But what we can know is what he said, or what Plato said he said. And so at this point, Socrates just says, that's the explanation. What have I been doing? I've just been wandering around asking people questions. It embarrassed some of them. They got mad at me, and that's why I'm here. But I can't help but do it. It's what the gods directed me to do. So it's unfortunate, but it's just the reality. And these people will believe these bad things about me, that I'm a pre-Socratic, or I'm a sophist, or whatever, because they're already predisposed not to like me. And so that could be what's going on in the mind of the jurors. But at that point, Socrates stops his defense against the earlier accusers. Then he goes to the most recent accusers, which we're not going to read through all this, but the charges are a little different, and that's when Miletus and Anytus, or Anytus, once again, pronounce it as you will. I've heard it pronounced Miletus, Melitus. It depends on if it's a hard E, soft E, however, or hard or soft translation of the E's. But the same with Anytus. These folks, the pronunciation isn't what matters in this context. What matters is that you can see the name and see the letters and say, okay, that's different than other letters in another name. That the charges are a little different for that he's accused by Miletus, these more recent accusers. These would have been the people standing in the court right then at that moment. Aristophanes may or may not have been in the court. He said, Socrates said he couldn't call all these people from the past that would have influenced the jurors to be witnesses or to admit what they've been doing. So we don't know. But these, Miletus and them, are in the courtroom at that moment, and that the official charges to the official trial that Socrates is actually engaged in, like he just gives the early accusers charges against him on their behalf. He's not actually charged necessarily with what the earlier accusers have labeled him as. This is what he's actually charged with as far as the law goes, of corrupting the young, not believing in the gods the city believes, but in new spiritual things. That's the official charges against Socrates. And so Socrates is going to try to defend himself against those. And you can read through this. I mean, some cases, some of it's a case of mistaken identity. But what he really does is takes this head accuser, Miletus or Miletus, and tries to show that Miletus never really cared about any of the stuff he's accusing me of. And the implication is nor do these other more recent accusers, that they're doing this for their own nefarious purposes, or because they don't like me, or they've been put up by their patrons, their payers, their backers to do these charges against me. And that could be because of his association with the 30 tyrants. It could be that it could be the early rumors he's a sophist, he's pre-Socratic. But it could be that these people were some of the ones that got, and some of them were, Miletus and them were some of the ones that had gotten booted out of Athens by the 30 tyrants. So Socrates does not accept that they're there out of the goodness of their hearts trying to look out for the good of Athens or the Athenian youth. He doesn't buy it. And he actually says, well, what I'm going to show is that they're acting in bad faith, essentially. That's one way to think of what he accuses them of. And he goes through, he winds his way through various reasoning, not whine like crying, but wind like you wind a clock. Twisting, turning ways of reasoning. And he asks Miletus questions, Miletus answers. He drives him into contradictions, various things. That happens. You can read it. There's a sort of play-by-play, a sort of general play-by-play. Not every move, but you can read through that when you're looking at the apology. And the end result is he eventually says, see, Miletus and them, they're acting in bad faith. I'm not guilty of the things they're accusing me of. But then we get to, near the end of this, Socrates' defense of doing philosophy. This is important to us. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on it, but definitely read this. That Socrates raises the possibility of if one of the jurors were to ask him, well, Socrates, would you stop doing what you've been doing if it meant that we would acquit you of these charges today? If we'd let you go free, let you live? Would you stop doing this annoying stuff that you've been doing? Socrates' answer, no, absolutely not. If I had to do it all over again, I'd still keep doing it. Well, why? Well, one is because if he were to stop doing philosophy because he's afraid of dying, well, then that wouldn't be good. That would be a life lived in constant fear of death. He'd be acting like what Socrates would say is a coward. That you don't do what you think you should do or you should do, which is what he felt was the case with his God-appointed mission, that if I stop being true to myself and doing this mission that I'm doing, then I'm a coward. If I stop it because I'm afraid to die, well, that's not a reason worth having of stopping what I'm doing. That's one of his rebuttals or answers to why will you not stop doing this if given the chance, even if it could save your life, because it'd be a coward and I'd be getting my priorities mixed up. The most important values for Socrates is like doing good, being a virtuous person, having a virtuous soul, things like that. You can read that in the Apology and in many other works of Plato about Socrates. That Socrates was more concerned about the status of his soul, his morality, his decency as he understood it, his piety in regards to the gods, according to his God-appointed mission, that his integrity. That is what matters more to Socrates, according to Socrates at least. That's what mattered more. And what that means is that those things take precedent over merely me keeping on living for another 20 years. Remember, Socrates is 70 at the time of this trial. So he's lived a long time in ancient times already. And he's like, why would I stop now? I mean, to be a coward at the end of my life when I've never been one my whole life. It's worth noting Socrates was a hero soldier during the Peloponnesian Wars, the second one with the Spartans in Athens. He saved a lot of troops and a lot of civilians, supposedly. I mean, that he was tough. He didn't complain. He was a good soldier. So it's like to him, this notion of cowardice means something, and then also philosophy, to avoid doing philosophy is, it's like, it'd be to violate his very God-appointed mission, that he's not going to do that. It's like he says, I'll obey the gods any day of the week over you jurors. Y'all can tell me to do whatever you want. You can just sentence me to death, tell me to stop doing philosophy, and I'm going to do what the God says rather than what y'all tell me to do. Maybe not the best tactic, admittedly, when your life's on the line. But then again, maybe it is, if that's what his genuine outlook is. And so he keeps going with this. It's like, well, one of the ideas too is it would be self-defeating of Socratic wisdom in his mind, because he would say that we don't know, or he didn't know what was on the other side of death, like whether it's going to be a good thing for him or a bad thing for him. And that's consistent with the Greek mythos. You don't know which way you're going to go. That's at the whim of the gods and the goddesses. There's Hades and waiting areas and all kinds of stuff in the early Greek spiritual worldview, but you still really don't know. And so for all Socrates knows, he could end up in the Greek version of heaven with all the big heroes of Troy and all their adventure tales. And so, or he could end up in eternal torment in some terrible situation if the gods or goddesses are displeased with how he's fulfilled his mission. He doesn't know. And so he says, if I don't know about death, why in the world would I ever be afraid of it? It's like, if I were to stop doing philosophy because I'm afraid of death, well, then I would effectively be arranging my life in a way based around a fear of something that I don't even know if I should be afraid of. So that's like claiming to know something that he doesn't really know by living in a different way than he's been living. Hopefully that's understandable. You can read the description if not. But it's like he would be violating the very wisdom that he supposedly has in order to stop doing what he's been doing because he's afraid of dying. That would be a violation of the very Socratic wisdom. The only little dinky wisdom he has is to know what he doesn't know and not claim otherwise. And he thinks that if he stopped doing philosophy for fear of being executed, if he kept doing it, then he would be living in a way that's essentially claiming that he knows something about death, that it's something worthy of being feared, and acting in that way, he would be living not only a lie, but a very unwise way of living. That's another way to describe it. So about this time, the verdict gets handed down. He's guilty. 280 jurors voted guilty. 220 said not guilty. Well, then Socrates had, then it's a matter of the sentencing. Well, how should we sentence you, Socrates? And he gives his thoughts. He's like, well, I've been doing this big service for Athens, been helping all these people realize they're ignorant. I've been trying to help people see that they should prioritize virtuous living over wealth and gaining prestige, that care more for the nature of their soul and other Athenians and actual and everyday interest of people rather than, your own self, wealth, and profiteering. And I've been doing all those things. I'm the gadfly of Athens. I've been stinging the horse on the nose and the behind to get, and Athens is the horse in the analogy, and I've been trying to prod it in better directions while doing my God-appointed mission. And so he says, I should be rewarded for this. You can give me fancy dinners, if you're going to say I'm guilty of what? Of what? Doing a good thing for Athens? Well, then you should reward me. That if you're charging me I'm guilty of doing philosophy, if that's what you're saying, then you should just reward me. Well, that didn't turn out too good. As one might suspect, more jurors voted for execution after this than voted for him to be guilty. So his idea of you should reward me for what I've been doing good things for Athens, that didn't play too well with the jurors. But also in the context of this is this notion that he says that I wouldn't change a thing, that the unexamined life's not worth living. And we'll get a chance to talk about that more this week. But just it's worth reading all the parts around that. So Socrates is sentenced to death. Now, you can look through this and think about it and how the sophists fit into it, how the 30 tyrants fit into it, how Aristophanes fits into it. All of those three things could have had they did have some influence on why Socrates was being tried and why the sentencing comes out the way it does, why the verdict could potentially came out the way it did, who was accusing him, the most recent accusers. They are definitely associated with the ones that were pushed out of Athens by the 30 tyrants. So there's a lot of other stuff that's going on in the background. I mean, this is a real human set of events. It's not disconnected from all the other things that were happening at the time. Then there's the Crito. There's a summary of kind of a summary here. It's worth reading. That's why it's included this week. The Crito is ultimately Socrates has a chance to escape. He's waiting in the equivalent of jail for execution after the sentencing, and his friends show up, Crito and others, and they say, Socrates, we can pay the guards, you can escape. Which during the time in Athens, that would have been totally fine. I mean, they sent people into exile rather than executing them. That Socrates could have very well, his friends have paid off the court. They could have bundled him up, got him out of there, gone to another Greek city-state. There's 1,000 plus to choose from. And as long as he stayed out of the way of Athens, he could have gone and hung out with the Spartans. And they would have protected him. It's not like the Athenians were likely to send people after you. It's like these city-states are like autonomous zones of each other. And so there's a much wider world too. Socrates could have got his family and probably got off of this. But Socrates says, no, it wouldn't be just to do that. And he gives his reasoning for why it would not be just to do so. And it all turns on, it's these obligations and commitments that he takes, that he has already tacitly given consent to by having lived his life in Athens and been an Athenian, and all the goods and services and privileges and opportunities that has brought him, that he thinks that by escaping, he would be in some way damaging or acting like an unappreciative child to escape when the Athenian legal system has ruled him guilty and sentenced him to death. And then at the end of the Crito, he drinks hemlock and he dies. But the Crito is well worth reading. It's a lot to think about going on in the Crito. Now, we're at the end of this. The Quest for Truth, the philosophical worldview, you can read through this. The key to it is that Socrates' way of questioning and searching for answers to, like, what is piety? What is truth? What is justice? What are these things? That way of questioning and asking experts and not being surprised when they don't know what they think they know, but also giving reasons and argumentation, really carefully analyzing what answers are offered to questions, what the implications of those answers are. All of that becomes the argumentative, like, modus operandi of philosophy and the way it's still practiced to this day. It all's about answering, questions are asked, answers are provided, and then reasons and evidence and data is offered in support or denial of those answers. And then there's objections, replies, trying to build theories of that are coherent of the nature of reality, truth, knowledge. What is knowledge? What is reality? And then building monstrous theories and answers that are as well defended as possible that could be plausible answers to those type of questions. Socrates and Plato and all of them are doing all of that. And it's like, but Socrates is where it kind of begins. And it has a human element to it. That the pre-Socratics are more proto-science. They're worried about, these forces and perhaps divine entities, not personalized, but still entities that and elements of the cosmos. That's what they're focused on. The sophists are on, can you make an argument that wins the day? Socrates, though, is over here dealing with argumentation in the search for truth. He's searching for answers to these fundamental questions about reality, but it's also in the human domain, like morality, like what does it mean to live a good life? What does it mean to be virtuous? What does it mean to be courageous or cowardly? And he's going to ask like generals and soldiers and stuff. And so Socrates is opening this whole gamut of human questions, like what is a good government versus a bad government? Or what are the pros and cons of ways of governing people? What, just on and on. This whole domain of questions that you would get in psychology, sociology, political science, just any ethics, wherever it shows up, whether it's in a medical field or a legal field. I mean, Socrates is opening the door to all those kind of questions. And all those branches of philosophy that we saw during the first week, many of those questions that are still being investigated today are questions Socrates posed 2,500 years ago. And advancements have been made, that we have a lot more answers and a lot more reasons and a lot more theories today than it had. But the ball gets rolling with Socrates and his way of questioning and seeking answers. And it's just sheer relentlessness to doing so. That is part of this philosophical worldview. And the only way you can do that is to have a kind of detached perspective where you can put on the perspective of the relativist subjectivist for a moment. Or you can take that off and look at things through real politics. Or you can look at things through ideology. Or you can look at things through the spiritual worldview or the more empirical modern science worldview. That you don't get wedded to any particular worldview. You can, of course, all humans will have something, that they accept and see, and it's the way they understand reality. But the philosophy person can shift between these worldviews and has to. And Socrates does that throughout his reasoning. And if one reads more of those early Plato dialogues, you'll see that. And so that's kind of just a hallmark of being able to detach oneself from one's own perspective and worldview, and then temporarily at least entertain and try to see the world through the eyes of another that may have an entirely different point of view. And now that, of course, we're human. We don't get all this perfect. We don't always live up to these ideals. But Socrates was the embodiment trying to live this way and think this way. And I mean, Socrates had a worldview. It looks like a Greek spiritual worldview. I mean, he was doing his God-appointed mission by Apollo. And according to his own words, he was. And so there's also this notion of humility. This built into the way philosophy people tend to see the world, is that's that humility of, we don't have all the answers. We'd be really glad to just know what we don't know. And see, that's sometimes we think we know when we don't. But it's this awareness that we could always be mistaken about things. That doesn't mean that philosophy people won't commit and defend something very well and try to amass huge amounts of reasons and evidence in favor of certain answers to certain questions. By no means, philosophy people will do that every day, but there's always supposed to be this hint of doubt in a philosophy person's mind that you could be mistaken. And that's different than certain other fields where it's like if you get someone that's worked, say, in biology for 40 years, a biologist is going to see the world in a very particular biologic sort of way, that will be reality. And that biologists may no longer be able to just detach out. They're still human, they can, but they may not even see that there's a need to do that. They know this is just the facts of reality. That's the way they are. This is the way cells work. This is how bodies of whole cells make whole organisms. This is how whole iguanas, or what iguanas are, etc. Here's what life is. This is what, their observations over 40 years. And the reality is they very likely are right about some of it. But, they have the truth, or they've caught a glimpse of it. But the thing is, it's not inbuilt into biology that you have to always, and keep it firmly up front that you could be mistaken. Or at least it doesn't seem to be. Science is supposed to be open to all these possibilities, but it doesn't always seem to play out that way at times. Philosophy doesn't either, but it's built right into the core like it is in science, because science comes out of philosophy. Where does science get this notion from? But this notion of emphasizing humility is that's over in philosophy and also in spiritual worldviews. But it is a hallmark of philosophy, regardless of how many other worldviews share it. It is a hallmark also of philosophy, and then all these other aspects of it. And also this unapologetic intransigence of Socrates, that you're facing death and yet you still hold the line. You still try to convince. You still try to give the best reasons. Not every philosophy person is willing to just fall over on their sword for philosophy or some philosophical idea, but there is this inbuilt resistance to being censored or blocked or forced to stop asking questions and looking for reasons. That's built into the field too. For better or worse, it exists inside the discipline of philosophy. We're at the end. Next week, we will start looking at Plato, and he develops out these things in a lot more detail, as well as throughout the semester. That's a core part of the class, is to become more familiar with this sort of philosophical way of seeing the world. And well, you don't have to accept it. It's just you're learning about it. But until then,